Good day. Today is Tuesday, 17th December 2024. We are coming towards the end of the year. The Biden administration still has a couple of weeks left, and all sorts of dramatic things continue to happen. And the big dramatic news that has taken place over the last 24 hours is the assassination in Moscow of the head of Russia's Chemical Protection Troops, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov. He is the most senior officer who's died in the Russian armed forces by violent action, through violent deeds, since the beginning of the special military operation. Now, Reuters, most of the Western media, the entire Russian media have all been pointing their finger in one direction, which is towards Ukraine. There is a universal consensus that the Ukrainians were responsible for this assassination, which didn't, by the way, just assassinate Kirillov, but also assassinated or killed one of his aides, who was presumably considered by the Ukrainians an expendable person, somebody who they're not especially concerned about. But anyway, everybody is saying that it is the Ukrainians who carried out this assassination in Moscow. The Ukrainians themselves have been privately informing the Western media that they did indeed assassinate Kirillov. And I don't think anybody seriously has any doubts about this. What is really quite astonishing about this conduct by Ukraine is that Ukraine has in fact been engaged in a pattern of assassination of senior individuals, both in Russia and in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and in other regions now controlled by Russia, in Zaporozhye and Kherson, for many years now, going all the way back, in fact, to the start of the 2014 crisis. Assassination has been a regular practice carried out by the Ukrainians going back many of these years. And in fact, many people, myself, for example, was writing and speaking about this years and years ago. But at that time, the Ukrainians were denying it. They were pretending that all of these assassinations that were taking place, particularly those which took place in the Donbass, were supposedly the work of internecine fights between Donbass separatists. All sorts of things were said about the various people who, according to the Ukrainians, made up the Donbass separatists. They were often described as criminals or semi-criminals or members of organized crime groups, and it was insinuated that this is how people like that might be expected to behave. And many, many people in the West went on reporting and publicizing this material and accepting the Ukrainian account of these assassinations, accepting that it was as the Ukrainians said, people in the Donbass, people in Russia who were killing each other, and that Ukraine, despite all appearances, was in no way involved. And then some time ago, more than a year ago now, an article appeared in the New York Times, as I remember, mostly about the commander of Ukraine's military intelligence organization, Kirillov, which straightforwardly admitted that Ukraine had been engaged in this assassination attempt, these assassination actions, this assassination campaign, that the United States, that the CIA, that Western intelligence had known about this all along, that they'd been trying to restrain the Ukrainians or dissuade them from doing this sort of thing, but the Ukrainians simply went their own way, supposedly and allegedly, and continued murdering people in the Donbass, in Russia, in all sorts of other places. And according to this article, the US, the Western intelligence agencies, wrung their hands, but, well, they did absolutely nothing at all. They supposedly just went on working with Ukrainian intelligence even as it conducted these assassinations. But of course, the veil of secrecy continued to be drawn over all of this. Officially, Western governments never acknowledged that these assassination attempts were being conducted by Ukraine. And of course, the US always went along, to the extent that it ever discussed these assassinations, it went along with the Ukrainian fairy tale that these were the result of internecine murders carried out between various militia groups inside the Donbass. Bear in mind that all of this was going on, presumably with the full knowledge of the Ukrainian government, of the then Ukrainian president, Petro Poroshenko, even as supposedly a peace process to try to settle the conflict was underway, a peace process between Ukraine and the very militia groups that the Americans and the others knew the Ukrainians were murdering their leaders. Anyway, that process, of course, was the one that was set out in the Minsk agreement, and I can remember the German government, the French government, Merkel, Hollande, and then after Hollande left the scene, Merkel and Sarkozy pretending that this peace agreement, this peace process was seriously intended, including by Ukraine, even as these murders continued. And, well, to my mind, that already all but confirms the deep cynicism with which Western governments approached the whole Minsk process. Merkel and Hollande have made very damaging interviews which have basically destroyed Merkel's reputation in Russia about the fact that the Minsk process was used by Ukraine with the full knowledge of the Germans and the French, basically to rearm and to prepare for the next war. And, of course, presumably Merkel was being briefed, would have known that even as the Ukrainians were going through the pretense of working to enact the Minsk agreement, they were busy murdering the people they were supposed to have negotiated that agreement with. And, by the way, if we continue with Western cynicism for the moment, the German and French governments, Merkel herself, continued throughout that time to insist that the sanctions on Russia agreed in 2014 needed to remain in place until the Minsk agreement was being implemented, the very same agreement where Ukraine was assassinating the leaders of the militias with whom it was supposed to be implementing that agreement. So the cynicism behind all of this has been astonishing. But, well, now the mask has dropped. Kirillov, a lieutenant general of the Russian armed forces, a very senior officer within the Russian military, has now been assassinated in Moscow in what, in any other context or in most other contexts, certainly if such a thing were ever done to a senior military officer, Western military officer, in any Western capital, would be called a terrorist act, just saying. Well, even as this happens, Western governments, Western officials, Western journalists who went along with the fiction previously that these were all internecine murders, that Ukraine was entirely innocent of conducting these murders. Now, they not only quite openly and without any seeming embarrassment admit and acknowledge that it was the Ukrainians who murdered Kirillov, but in some cases they even rejoice in the act. Hamish de Bretton Gordon, for example, in the Daily Telegraph, has just written a piece in which he basically makes clear his own strong approval of the assassination of Kirillov in Moscow. Just saying. And to make the whole appearance of cynicism even greater, just shortly before I made this video, even as the Ukrainians have been bragging to the Western media about their role in carrying out this murder of Kirillov in Moscow, Zelensky's advisor, his top aide, Mikhailo Podolyak, has been going on Ukrainian television and to the Ukrainian media, and he's once again resurrected that cynical story that in fact Kirillov was probably or might have been killed as a result of internal quarrels in Russia. Maybe he was going to turn whistleblower or something like that, and the result is that someone in the Russian Defense Ministry took the decision to silence him. I wonder whether this time some people again in the West are going to pick up Podolyak's story and are going to run with it. But frankly, the cynicism, the whole cynicism that has marked this entire process, extending all the way back to 2014, disgusts me even more than the murders themselves, and that extends to the murder of Kirillov. Now, let's now talk about that murder. Kirillov was a very senior military officer in Moscow. He was a member of the Russian military staff. He is not, so far as I know, someone who has been involved directly in planning or executing the special military operation in Ukraine. He is responsible within the Russian military system and has been since 2017 in nuclear, biological and chemical protection of troops. That officially is what he has been appointed to do, and that is the branch of the service that he commands. Now, over the last year or so, the United States and Ukraine have been insinuating that the Russians have been using chemical weapons in the zone of the special military operation. And of course, Kirillov, as the commander of Russia's chemical weapons troops, the ones that are supposed to deal with protection from attacks by chemical weapons, he is held directly responsible. The United States sanctioned him, as by the way, it has sanctioned lots of other senior Russian military officers. The day before the assassination, the Ukrainians published a warning that Kirillov was a wanted man because of war crimes he was supposed to have perpetrated on Ukrainian territory. The trouble is, I don't take these claims personally about chemical weapons attacks by the Russians on Ukrainian territory seriously. First of all, why would the Russians conduct such attacks in Ukraine, given that they're winning the war and that they're advancing on every front, and that the Ukrainians are short of weapons, and they're short of ammunition, and above all, they're short of men, and there's huge recriminations within Ukraine about the supposed incompetence of their generals, and all kinds of things like that. Why would the Russians put themselves in a position where they would invite international criticism by engaging in this kind of war crime? And if something like this really had taken place on any significant scale, I can't help but think that we would have had not just far more evidence of it produced by the Ukrainians themselves, but that there would have been an enormous, deafening outcry about it in the West, and the fact that there has not been, at any point during the entire period of the special military operation, I think conclusively proves that evidence of it is so threadbare as to be in effect non-existent. Of course, possibly some chemical weapons have been used at various times. I'm not absolutely rejecting that possibility, but not all chemical weapons are prohibited. It could be, for example, that the Russians might have used tear gas or CS gas or some such gas in some locations, perhaps to clear buildings or to do things of that kind. Kirillov is also said to have been in part responsible for the development of the terrifying TOS systems, the multiple launch rocket systems which fire rockets, or sometimes indeed guided missiles now, with various types of thermobaric or fuel air explosive warheads. I know that the two are different, but I don't fully understand what the difference is, by the way. But anyway, whatever, that he has apparently played some role in the development of these TOS weapons, though he only became head of the chemical troops in 2017, and the original TOS weapons were developed during the era of the Soviet Union. There's some suggestions that he was involved in the development of the TOS-2 system, which has not, however, so far been operating on the battlefields of Ukraine in any great number. Thermobaric weapons, weapons of this kind, for all sorts of historic reasons, are operated, apparently, by the Russian chemical warfare troops as opposed to the conventional artillery. Again, exactly why this is so, I've no idea. All I would say is that I understand that that is the case. But anyway, I don't think that Kirillov was murdered for that reason. I don't think he was murdered for the reason that there was any significant chemical weapons used by the Russians over the course of the war in any of the Ukrainian battlefields. As I said, evidence for that has been incredibly sketchy. The Russians, by the way, have made similar allegations about Ukrainian use of chemical weapons. Again, I would say that this evidence is very, very sketchy. I'm not going to devote any time to it. I never have done in any previous program. So that then brings us to the question of why Kirillov was targeted in this way. Given that, as I said, because of the role he plays, he cannot have played any very central role in the actual conduct of the operations in the area of the SMO. He's not a commander of troops. He's not an infantry or tank officer. He's not one of the planners at the General Staff. So why was he targeted in this way? Well, there is one very simple reason, and I am going to suggest that it is perhaps the most likely one, and that is that precisely because he wasn't anyone centrally involved in the conduct of the war, he was perhaps less heavily protected than other officers like Gerasimov and Mordvichev and Teplinsky and Rudskoy, the operations chief of the General Staff, and people like that were. So he was a relatively easy target, precisely because he was not directly involved in the war. And in fact, the report suggests that there was very little protection provided to him. The explosives, apparently, which killed him were concealed inside a scooter. There are ways, I happen to know this, of noticing suspicious vehicles or objects. Proper bodyguard services, of which Russia, by the way, has no shortage, would notice this kind of thing. It doesn't look as if Kirillov was provided with that level of protection. So maybe he was a soft target, and perhaps that is why he was tracked. There is, however, another possible reason, and I'm not going to say that this was the reason he was killed, but I'm going to just mention it because it's the reason that I think is most widely circulating in Russia itself. And that is that because of his functions, Kirillov was precisely the officer within the Russian military system who had been talking most about the presence, the physical presence of all kind of laboratories operated by the United States on Ukrainian territory. I have not discussed this issue at any length in these programs. It's a very sensitive one, as I found on the one occasion that I did, and I'm not going to say more about it. All I will say is that Kirillov was the person who used to give press conferences and details about all of this activity or alleged activity, which the Russians, by the way, on several occasions resubmitted to the UN Security Council, and which the Western media has essentially ignored. And perhaps unsurprisingly, because of all of this, he has been accused of engaging in propaganda and misinformation campaigns. And if you want to engage in a certain line of speculation, you might say that by providing a great deal of information on this topic, Kirillov upset and angered certain very, very powerful people, not just in Ukraine, and for that reason, a decision was made to put him out of the way. Now, I am, as you will have noticed, choosing my words here extremely carefully. As I said, this is a very sensitive topic altogether, as I've already discovered. I don't know whether this is true. All I would say is that if it was true, it would be a terrible thing. It would make this murder, which is what this is, even worse. And one would like to hope that one day the fact would be exposed and the people would be brought to account, though I think it most unlikely that will ever happen. Anyway, those are the two theories. Perhaps what for the moment will remain my preferred theory, that he was targeted because he was relatively easily tracked and exposed and was vulnerable to assassination because he was not securely protected. But the other one, the one I've just mentioned, which is much more sinister. Well, there we are. We will see what the results of the criminal investigations the Russians conduct, what the result of those investigations is going to throw up. Already, some people in Russia are pointing fingers and are pointing them to parties outside the West. Again, I'm not going to discuss this. It's the first hours after the assassination. It's premature to draw any immediate conclusions at this time. We'll just have to wait and see what the investigations say. Now, whenever assassinations of this kind take place in Russia, whenever the Ukrainians do this kind of thing, there is always a storm of demands, both within Russia and, by the way, outside Russia, from all sorts of people, some of whom are, I'm sure, speaking in good faith. They're always very angry on Russia's behalf and are bewildered why the Russians do not play a game of an eye for an eye and conduct the same kind of murders and assassinations and missile strikes and decapitation strikes and all of those kind of things. You find lots of people outside Russia who talk in that way. Some of them do so, as I said, most of them do so in complete good faith. In a few cases, I have to say, I doubt that, actually. I think that some people who demand and insist on that sort of thing are following completely different agendas, either mocking the Russians in order to make them appear weak, or in the alternative, mocking the Russians in order to goad them into some sort of reaction. But anyway, as night follows day, I predict that there will be comments in all sorts of places, including most likely on the threads of this particular video, which will demand some sort of massive, overwhelming, brutal reaction by the Russians to put the Ukrainians in their place, to punish the Ukrainian perpetrators of this act, to go after the people who were in charge of it, to do something awesome and terrifying and terrible. I don't know what the Russians are going to do. It is possible, in fact, it's very likely that they will respond. The former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, former prime minister as well, and now the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, has, however, issued a statement. And I'm going to read extracts from it, which have been published by the Russian news agency TASS. Attempts to intimidate our nation, stop the Russian offensive, or sow fear are doomed. Certain punishment awaits banderites, including the top military and political leaders of a crumbling country. This terrorist attack demonstrates the agony of the regime, which is struggling to justify its shaky existence in the eyes of its Western patrons and prolong the deadly hostilities whilst delivering cowardly attacks on civilians in towns and cities. Igor Kirillov was a military leader known for his unwavering devotion to duty. I knew him as a dedicated professional and as a reliable, honest and responsible person. Now, Medvedev has positioned himself throughout the SMO as the hardest of hardliners in Moscow. And if you take a step back and remember the stance he has taken, you will notice what a measured statement in some respects this is. There's no threats here some enormous, devastating retaliation. There's not going to be an eye for eye response. Certain punishment awaits the perpetrators, but then that perhaps might imply some kind of legal process. And bear in mind that Medvedev is a lawyer, and by the way, and from the record, I've heard from people who are familiar with him, an outstandingly good one, just to say. But there is no fire-breathing threats of huge retaliations or anything of that kind. And the secret lies in the first words: attempts to intimidate our nation, stop the Russian offensive, or sow fear, are doomed. And this clearly is what Medvedev thinks this assassination was ultimately all about. It was about intimidating the Russians, causing them to slow down or stop their offensive because they would be frightened of continuing with it. Not obviously the general population or the soldiers on the battle lines, but the senior political and military leaders in Moscow who are making the key decisions. Or to sow fear in general. These are all doomed. Russia is the kind of country which, having fought many wars, having endured this sort of thing many, many times, is not going to be panicked or stampeded into taking precipitate action, which it will later regret. And that's my take of Medvedev's words. Now, another Russian leader has spoken, and in a very similar vein, though he spoke before this assassination took place, but he did speak very recently. And that leader was Putin. And here I am going back to what Putin said 2 days ago at the meeting of the Defense Ministry Board in Russia. He said that the Western powers conduct hybrid wars and implement containment policies against us in a bid to weaken our country and inflict a strategic defeat on us. The US continues to pump the actually illegitimate regime in Kiev with weapons and money, as well as sending mercenaries and military advisors, thereby further encouraging escalation of the conflict. Simultaneously, under the pretext of a non-existent Russian threat, they scare their people that we intend to attack someone. This is a very simple tactical ploy. They push us to our red lines that we cannot allow them to cross. But when we respond, they frighten their population with first the Soviet in the old days and with the Russian threat today. So what Putin is saying here is that this is in fact the general game that is constantly played. The West deliberately, time and again, comes up and crosses red lines. Missile strikes on Russian territory, murders of senior military officers in Moscow. And the purpose of this is to provoke escalation. He actually talks about this, encouraging further escalation of the conflict, to provoke escalation. And the purpose of doing this is to frighten Western publics into believing that there is an actual, genuine, real threat to them from Russia, as Western publics had previously been told there was from the Soviet Union, and use this fear, this atmosphere of fear, in order to boost military spending, increase pressure on Russia, even more, increase support for Ukraine, do that kind of thing. And the Russians, of course, understand that. They can't, obviously, simply sit back and allow their red lines to be trampled over. And by the way, murdering a top military official in the capital of the nation he serves is most definitely a crossing of a red line. But the Russians know what that is all about. And again, they're not going to be stampeded and provoked into doing something that later they're going to regret. That doesn't mean that they're not going to do anything. At some point, going back to Medvedev, what Medvedev says, they will exact punishment. That was the word he used. And I am sure Medvedev and Putin and the Russians mean what they say. But revenge, as the French used to say, is a dish to be eaten cold. And that's the approach the Russians have taken throughout the war. And it is the approach which I believe they're going to continue to take in this case. Now, there is almost certainly another reason for this attack. And that was that this was probably an attempt to create tensions between the political and military leadership in Moscow. Kirillov is a senior military officer. He is somebody that everybody in the defense ministry will have known and will have known well. Medvedev says he knew him. Putin obviously would have known him. But Gerasimov and all of the others, the general staff and all of those people would have known him as a close colleague and in some cases a friend. And almost certainly this is an attempt to create tensions between the military and the politicians. The hope or the expectation is that the military leadership will be furious and exasperated. They will become furious and angry with Putin himself because of the fact that he appears to be continuing to take this measured approach to the war. And this will supposedly, or perhaps that's the hope, this will shake confidence in him and create tensions between the military and the political leaders. I am absolutely sure that this tactic is going to fail. Again, this doesn't, in my experience, take into account the psychology of the country against which this sort of thing is being done. The military leadership in Russia, to a far greater extent than military leaderships in Western countries, as part of their training, their military training, their training through the general staff schools and all of those sort of things, are not only trained to think in a military way, but also a political one as well. In fact, the boundary between the military and the political does not exist in Russia in the same kind of way that it does in the West. They will understand fully why this was done. They will realize fully that this is an attempt to cause trouble between them and Putin. And their instinctive response will be to close ranks, not to create more trouble, not to expose tensions within the civilian and political leadership, which, in my opinion, is much more closely interconnected and integrated in Russia than it is in other countries. I think, on the contrary, the politicians and the military will see this as an attack on themselves, and far from coming apart and arguing and being angry with each other, what is much more likely to do is to harden them even further and make them even more determined to see this war through. As for Russian senior officers being intimidated or frightened by this kind of thing, again, the military ethos, I would have expected in most countries, but certainly in Russia, is that a senior military officer, for a senior military officer, death by arms is an occupational hazard and one which they must face. That doesn't mean that they will be any the less angry because of what has happened, but it means that what has happened isn't going to intimidate them. So, for the record, I think this is a major misstep. It's a misstep by Ukraine, which I think has done this thing because they want to provoke the Russians into an overreaction, again, in order to derail potential talks between Russia and the United States after Donald Trump becomes president. Why Ukraine wants to do that, by the way, given that it needs peace more than Russia does, well, that's for a later discussion. But anyway, I think that is what the Ukrainians want. They want to force the Russians or provoke the Russians into doing something that will make talks between the US and Russia all but impossible. I think that's their primary purpose. But that's not going to work. It's not going to panic the Russians into calling off their offensive. It's not going to do any one of these things. As for the Western powers, as I said, their cynicism in the face of this has been exposed. Most countries around the world loathe terrorism. Modi in India does. Xi Jinping in China does. The Saudis, who've played an active role at times in terrorism, as I think is widely acknowledged, have come to fear it themselves. Most countries around the world will be shocked that this has happened. And again, it strengthens the Russians in discussions with these countries. The Russians can say, look, these are the people we have to deal with. You see the sort of people they are. You cannot expect us to make any serious concessions to them. We have avoided engaging in this kind of assassination game that they have conducted against us, but they have shown no restraints, nor have the Western powers. These adversaries of ours, both in Ukraine and in the West, are not only dangerous and reckless and completely ruthless, but they exercise no restraints in what they can do, in what they're prepared to do, and you cannot therefore expect us to appease them in the way that you might have considered desirable if these people were indeed reasonable people. So I think that overall the mood in Moscow is going to be strengthened by this affair. And I think in terms of the diplomacy, not that I think this is a serious consideration at this point in the war, I think the Russian hand has been strengthened further. Anyway, that now brings me to the question of the negotiations. I get the sense that after Trump's meetings in Paris, there was a whole flurry of activity that took place, in which all sorts of discussion and talk, about how to try to maneuver Trump into some kind of negotiation process which might not really ultimately succeed. And I think one of the major ideas here was this sending of a peacekeeping force to Ukraine. It was first discussed in detail by the Russians, actually, by Sergei Narishkin, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. He said that the Europeans were trying to cobble together a 100,000-man intervention force. And by the way, he proved right, not about the size of the force, but about the fact that an intervention force was indeed being in the process of being assembled, or at least there was one person who was trying to assemble it, and that was Emmanuel Macron. And he went to Poland, and he went to other countries, and there was a meeting of the European Council, and there was all sorts of discussions about putting an intervention force like this together. However, Lawrence Norman, journalist in the Wall Street Journal, in discussing the possibility of sending such a supposed peacekeeping force to Ukraine, discusses the difficulties. Everything I have heard from Russians tells me that this is just as unacceptable to Moscow as NATO membership itself, and would therefore make an agreement impossible. Now, that happens to be true. I must admit, there is a question that I have about this particular sentence. Has Mr. Norman been actually speaking to the Russians, or to Russians? In which case, which Russians? Are we talking about journalists or diplomats or academics or someone else? Just asking. Or is he getting this information, as I am, from the Russian media and from the statements of Russian officials? Anyway, I just posed that question. He is absolutely right, however. The Russians have consistently ruled out sending a peacekeeping force from the West to Ukraine. This idea was first floated, by the way, several years ago, well before the special military operation began. The people who first floated it were the Ukrainians. The Americans backed them. It was suggested, and this is done over the course of one of the many meetings that took place between the Russians and the Ukrainians and the others over the course of the Minsk Agreement. It was suggested that this peacekeeping force should be deployed in the line of contact. The Russians immediately said no, that they would never agree to a peacekeeping force of that kind, especially if it was approved by the UN Security Council. They would have no doubt at all that the peacekeeping force in question would immediately start taking instructions from Brussels and Washington, and would, in effect, work to the advantage of Ukraine. And since then, over the course of the Istanbul Agreement, for example, the Russians made it an absolute condition of the Istanbul Agreement, to which the Ukrainian negotiators, by the way, agreed, that there would be no foreign forces deployed in Ukraine and no foreign bases deployed in Ukraine, even on the most temporary basis, unless this was agreed by Moscow in advance, with the implication that it never would be. So there is no possibility that the Russians will accept troops, certainly not from NATO countries, even if not operating under a NATO flag, but certainly they would never accept peacekeepers. They have consistently ruled that out. That is an idea that will not fly. And Mr. Norman is absolutely right that as far as the Russians are concerned, this is every bit as unacceptable as the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. But then, beyond that, comes the killer, because if this is an unacceptable plan to the Russians, it is also an unacceptable plan, as it turns out, to Donald Trump. Moreover, European countries would agree to send their troops only if they had an ironclad guarantee from Washington that the United States would intervene if they were attacked. This, in effect, punts the decision back to Washington, not Kiev, and not Brussels, Warsaw, or Paris. Now, I have consistently said, and we on the Duran, that is to say Alex Christoforou and I, have consistently said that all of Macron's various plans and proposals about sending French troops to Ukraine, his attempt to insert the French Foreign Legion into Ukraine, his attempt to get the British and the Ukraine and the Baltic states and the Poles to send troops to Ukraine, it all ultimately has one objective, which is to get the Americans involved. The European troops go into Ukraine. The Russians have always said that if they go into Ukraine, they go as combatants. The Russians attack these troops. These European troops are in no condition to fight the Russian army, as Macron and every European leader perfectly well knows. At that point, they all dash off to Washington and they tell the Americans, please, please, come and help us, because if you don't, not only will we be defeated by the Russians, not only will this bring the Russians to the gates of Europe itself, Western Europe itself, but we will all lose faith in NATO, in the US guarantee, and that will be the end of NATO, and the United States will lose forever our support. So that is the plan. It's all about ultimately involving the United States. Now, Donald Trump has made it absolutely clear, and apparently he said this in Paris, but other US officials have also been saying it, that there will be no US troops sent to Ukraine, not under any circumstances. And I cannot imagine that Donald Trump, who is now being advised by some very rational people, just saying, people like Rick Grenell, for example, and RFK Jr. and others, and by the way also Elon Musk, he will understand, he will be advised that if he were to give the Europeans this kind of ironclad guarantee that they're seeking, then as night follows day, he would find himself in a position where the Europeans called that ironclad guarantee in. This is a device to suck in the Americans. Donald Trump, I am sure, will be advised by his people not to fall for it. I am also, by the way, sure that he is intelligent enough and shrewd enough to see this for himself. This ironclad guarantee is not going to be provided. So the plan to send troops from Europe to Ukraine, deeply unpopular with the European public that it is not going to happen. The Russians oppose it. They're going to reject any agreement that requires them to agree to it. The Americans will refuse to give the Europeans the ironclad guarantee that the Europeans are seeking, and which for people like Macron is the entire purpose of the exercise. And without that ironclad guarantee, the Europeans are not going. I strongly suspect that this is why Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, rejected the entire suggestion of sending Polish troops as part of a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine when Macron broached it to him. I suspect that the Poles have been taking soundings in the United States from Trump's people. They've been told clearly that no such guarantee will be provided, no guarantee will be provided by the United States to protect these troops if they go. And for that reason, Tusk has made the decision that the Polish troops will not go. So there it is. That part of the plan has already, or so it seems to me, fallen apart. So we are therefore left with a situation where many elements of this proposal that has been floating around, a proposal which has never really crystallized, but which originated in certain suggestions that were made by Kellogg and Feitz in that report they published way back in April, which, as I discussed in an earlier program, was written mostly for the purpose of helping Trump through the US election. Anyway, we already see that many of the obstacles to realizing this proposal or set of proposals or perhaps ideas are already coming into focus, and they're making the plan, in effect, this proposal, unrealizable even before it begins. If deployment of a peacekeeping force is an essential part of this proposal, then it's not going to happen because the Russians oppose it, the Americans oppose it because they're not prepared to give the Europeans the necessary guarantees, and without the guarantees from the United States, the Europeans won't move. So already the proposal falls by the wayside. And this brings us back to the whole topic of discussions, of negotiations at this time. Trump is committed now to negotiations. I have always wondered whether that was at any time a good idea. Zelensky and his people in Ukraine show no interest in, no fundamental desire to conduct negotiations. They have rejected outright proposals from Viktor Orban of Hungary for a Christmas truce. There is talk that an exchange of prisoners is being prepared, but no talk of a Christmas truce. Zelensky has again spoken incredibly rudely about Orban, appearing to reject him as any kind of mediator or honest broker between the various parties, which begs the question of who Zelensky thinks would be prepared as an honest broker if Orban's offers are rejected in this way. Anyway, and we've already seen with this proposal about peacekeepers the problems which immediately arise. And nonetheless, some kind of a dialogue, some kind of contact between the Americans and the Russians remains essential. There has been a steady pattern of escalation throughout the war. There have been missile strikes on Russia, crossing red lines. The Russians have deployed and are now in the process of manufacturing in series the Oreshkin missile system, and they're going to deploy it to Belarus. The Russians have also deployed tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. The Russians are continuing to build up their armed forces. Belousov, in his speech to the Defense Ministry Board, talked about that at great length. And of course, the Russians continue to advance. So, what to do? The Ukrainians are not going to enter into negotiations with good faith. They have shown no readiness at any time to give up on their maximalist demands. In Europe, some leaders, Orban, Fico, perhaps quietly some others, would like to see some progress in terms of diplomatic initiatives. But other leaders, Macron, who remains in charge in France, perhaps Merz, once he becomes Chancellor in February, continue to be strongly opposed to any kind of agreement that would involve any significant concessions to the Russians. So the only option is for the Americans to talk directly to the Russians and to ignore the others. Now, there has been a very fine article in Foreign Affairs by Anatol Lieven, whom I have discussed many times, British scholar. He's written extensively about the diplomacy. I've not always agreed with him, I should say, but then all of us have a right to our various points of view. I have mine, and Anatol Lieven has his. Overall, I have found him a consistently insightful and interesting commentator on all of these issues. But he's written an article for Foreign Affairs, or rather, to be more precise, for Foreign Policy. It's always easy to get the two confused, at least I always do. But anyway, he's written an article, and he basically is saying the same thing. Or so I think. He says his argument is, well, this is the title: keep Ukraine out of talks to end its war. The Trump administration needs to engage Moscow and avoid at first involving Kiev. And this is what Anatol Lieven says: the incoming Trump administration seems generally committed to finding peace in Ukraine. Whether it's capable of the extremely complicated diplomacy required is a very different question. Can I just say, I think that's a bit hard. I don't know how skillful the diplomats that Donald Trump is going to employ are, and how skillful in diplomacy Donald Trump himself is. But this is a very intractable problem, and it might be more appropriate to acknowledge, as the writer on the Wall Street Journal basically does, that ultimately it may simply prove impossible to find common ground and to agree a settlement. Anatol Lieven himself essentially says as much later in his article. So let's not already, before the administration is even formed, start criticizing the inadequate diplomacy of Donald Trump. If it all fails, it's almost certainly not going to be because of him. But anyway, going back to Lieven, he says one issue that will have to be decided at the very start of the process is at what stage and on what issues Ukraine should be involved in the process. The issue is more fraught than has generally been acknowledged. The first and most fundamental goal of the talks, as in all such negotiations, will be for each side to clearly establish, on the one hand, its vital interests and absolute and non-negotiable conditions, and on the other hand, what points it is prepared in principle to compromise on. It may be, of course, that the non-negotiable positions of the three sides are fundamentally opposed and incompatible. If so, peace negotiations will inevitably fail, but we will not know this until these issues have been explored. And that is absolutely correct. As somebody who's been involved in my time in many negotiations, as a former litigator, I can say that nearly all the cases I remember being involved in ended through negotiations. That is exactly what you do. You meet with the other side, you have discussions, you have conversations, you find out what people are able to negotiate about and what they are not. And then you try and find some common ground, and then you build on it. And as Lieven absolutely correctly says, given the stance Ukraine is taking at the moment, it's all but impossible to imagine that Ukraine can give any ground on any significant point at all. And he puts it like this: the three parties involved are Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. The Europeans will not like the fact, by the way, that Lieven is excluding them, but I'm not going to dwell on that. The initial stages of the negotiations should be between the United States and Russia. It goes without saying that certain aspects of the eventual agreement will require Ukraine's full consent, and that without this assent, a settlement isn't possible. These aspects include the terms of a ceasefire, the nature and extent of any demilitarized zones, any constitutional amendments guaranteeing the linguistic and cultural rights of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. Given certain categorical, and he goes on to say entirely legitimate Ukrainian positions, a number of key issues seem to be a priori off the table, and if Russia insists on them, no agreement will be possible. And he gives examples, the demand that Ukraine recognize that the four regions are lawfully a part of Russia, the demand that Ukraine withdraw from all of the territory of the four regions that it still occupies, including places like Kherson City and Zaporozhye. And he says that these are demands which Ukraine will not agree to. The Russians have also, by the way, got their own demands, which they are not going to shift from either. And as Lieven says, if the Ukrainians and the Russians, are involved in the talks from the outset, these barriers will emerge immediately and the negotiations will collapse before they properly even begin. And Lieven about this is absolutely correct. Now, he goes on to speculate what the non-negotiable terms that the Russians have are. I agree with him on some points, maybe less so on others, but that's not what I want to dwell on. The point is that the first thing to do, the most important thing to do, is to get diplomatic contacts going between the Americans and the Russians. And they need to be not just about Ukraine, though Ukraine obviously is a hugely important topic. They need to be about everything else as well, about the situation in the Middle East, the situation in the Pacific, arms control, military deployments, nuclear weapons deployments, all of the very important things that two heavily armed nuclear superpowers should be in constant discussion and dialogue with each other about. It has been a criminal dereliction that during the period of the Biden administration, the United States basically ended all contacts with Moscow. It has led to an incredibly dangerous situation, this endless crossing of red lines, which has brought us to a very, very dangerous situation, that the very, very dangerous situation that Putin was talking about in his speech to the Defense Ministry Board. So the Russians and the Americans need to talk, and of course they also need to talk about Ukraine. This whole position that the Biden administration took, that there can be no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine, is actually ridiculous. It is, in effect, contracting out US foreign policy on the topic of what is universally acknowledged to be a proxy war between the United States and Russia. It is contracting out US foreign policy to Kiev, to Zelensky, and people like Kuleba, his former foreign minister, his new foreign minister Shmyhal, to all of these extraordinary people, the kind of people who've just conducted that assassination attempt that assassination in Moscow, not an attempt, an assassination in Moscow, who've recently been floating ideas about acquiring nuclear bombs, who have been demanding unlimited escalation against the Russians, who want Tomahawk missiles and all of those sort of things, and who've been floating preposterous ideas about victory plans. That was an absolute disaster. It is something that no US president has ever done. It is a massive act of, well, I'll say stupidity to ever agree to such a thing, even if the administration was conducting neocon objectives, which of course it was. So you have to start talking to the Russians, and that is the mutual interest. And of course, you need to talk about Ukraine, and you need to do the very thing that Anatol even spoke about. You need also to start talking about whether any kind of common ground can be found to try to get a negotiation to bring the war to an end, and to build on that so that you can actually move to a proper settlement. Now, as I said, I've said all of the positive things about the Lieven article. I'm going to make one further point about it, which isn't actually a criticism, but it is additional to it. And I am returning again to the point that I have made in many previous programs, which is that the article does speak about things that the Ukrainians will never agree to. They will never agree, for example, to agree to recognize the eastern territories currently under Russian control as Russian. They will always insist that they are theirs. And Lieven says that the Russians might be flexible on this. And I think that might be right. They might accept that what Ukraine decides or doesn't decide isn't really that important. Though I'm not as certain of this as Lieven appears to be. But anyway, put that aside. He also says that the Russians will probably agree, might possibly agree, to not to pursue their demand that Ukraine must withdraw from the entire territory of the 4 regions, that they must give up Kherson city and Zaporozhye city and all of those sort of things, because the Ukrainians cannot be expected to agree to that. Well, that may be right, but we come back to this fundamental truth about the war, which is that the Russians are winning, and they're going to go on winning. And as Belousov and Putin recently pointed out, and I have no doubt that they're telling the truth here, the Russians are getting stronger every day, even as the Ukrainians are getting weaker. It seems as if the Ukrainians, through their recent mobilizations, are unable to replace losses, and many of the troops that they're calling up are unreliable, and many desert. Whereas the Russians have an army consisting of professional soldiers who signed contracts. They're pushing steadily westwards. There is no reason to think that they're going to stop. Their army is getting bigger all the time. Ukraine's army is getting smaller. And the United States has already signaled that it cannot accept an unlimited drain on its military resources. So, given that this is so, the Russians have the advantage, a fact that they know perfectly well. And it may be that frank conversations with the Ukrainians about what they can expect the Americans to do and what they might have to concede might be as important as talking to the Russians as well. Just saying. Anyway, there it is. The point is that the danger is that if the Ukrainians continue to hold out for things that the Russians insist on, then there's every reason to think that the Russians will go on advancing westwards. And we've already seen Medvedev speak at the same conference where Putin also spoke about more annexations. So, there it is. That's what I wanted to say about negotiations. It's an important article by Leven. Let me take this opportunity to thank Jeff Roberts again for informing me of it. Let's talk briefly about what is going on the battlefronts. The most interesting news, I think, has come from Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have now admitted that General Tarnavsky's great counterattack to drive the Russians out of Shevchenko, this village that the Russians captured a few days ago, close to Pokrovsk, that counterattack has failed. The Russians have retained control of Shevchenko. They've also retained control of Novotroitsky. The Ukrainians have suffered losses. More likely than not, we're going to see further Russian advances. The Russians, according to all the reports, now control the entire residential zone of the city, the town of Kurachovo. It's only the thermal power plant to the west that is left. The Ukrainian troops who are there are now at serious risk of encirclement, even as the Russians clear all of the villages to the south. There is an incredibly bleak article today in The Economist about the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Kursk, that they're going to be facing a miserable winter, that they've now lost half the territory that Ukraine captured during its Kursk offensive in August. There's lots of stories about North Korean troops advancing in various parts of the battlefronts. None of the film that I've seen remotely corroborates this claim that maybe there are North Koreans there. I don't think so myself, but who knows. But anyway, the point is that the Russians are continuing to slice more and more territory away from the Kursk pocket, which is shrinking every day, where the Ukrainians continue to face very, very heavy losses there. And I'm going to make a further guess that between now and the new year, we're going to see another big Russian missile strike on Ukraine. And of course, we're all going to wait and see what steps, what the Russians do. And they will do something to avenge the murder of General Kirillov. So we're not going to see any end to the war, any end to the fighting before Trump is inaugurated. he said that that is what he wants, but we have to be realistic. I don't think that that is going to happen. I don't think anybody familiar with the situation thinks it's going to happen either. And the murder of Kirillov, the one thing it is almost certainly going to do is harden opinion in Moscow amongst more and more people, more and more important people, that this war needs to be brought to a victorious end, which means, as Medvedev has argued many times, that the regime in Kiev needs to be changed, that there has to be regime change in Kiev itself. So that's what I wanted to say. Now, let me first of all turn to the situation. Let me lastly turn to the situation in Syria. Bashar al-Assad, safely in Moscow, has now issued a statement, and I'm going to read it. He said that as terrorism spread across Syria and ultimately reached Damascus on the evening of Saturday, 7th December, questions arose about the president's fate and whereabouts. This occurred amidst a flood of misinformation and narratives far removed from the truth, aimed at recasting international terrorism as a liberation revolution for Syria. At such a critical juncture in the nation's history, where truth must take precedence, it is essential to address these distortions. Unfortunately, the prevailing circumstances at the time, including a total communication blackout for security reasons, delayed the release of this statement. This does not replace a detailed account of events that unfolded, which will be provided when the opportunity allows. So Assad is explaining and apologizing for the fact that he's not spoken to the Syrian people before, and he is promising that he will provide a more detailed account eventually. And then he goes on to say this: first, my departure from Syria was neither planned nor did it occur during the final hours of the battles, as some have claimed. On the contrary, I remained in Damascus, carrying out my duties until the early hours of Sunday, 8th December 2024. As terrorist forces infiltrated Damascus, I moved to Latakia in coordination with our Russian allies to oversee combat operations. Upon arrival at the Khmeimim air base that morning, it became clear that our forces had completely withdrawn from all battle lines and that the last army positions had fallen. As the field situation in the area continued to deteriorate, the Russian military base itself came under intensified attack by drone strikes. With no viable means of leaving the base, Moscow requested that the base's command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia on the evening of Sunday, 8th December. This took place a day after the fall of Damascus, following the collapse of the last military positions and the resulting paralysis of all remaining state institutions. At no point during these events did I consider stepping down or seeking refuge, nor was such a proposal made by any individual or party. The only course of action was to continue fighting against the terrorist onslaught. I reaffirmed that the person who, from the very first day of the war, refused to barter the salvation of his nation for personal gain or to compromise his people in exchange for numerous offers and enticements is the same person who stood alongside the officers and soldiers of the army on the front lines, just meters from terrorists and the most dangerous and intense battlefields. He is, of course, talking about himself. He is the same person who, during the darkest years of the war, did not leave but remained with his family alongside his people, confronting terrorism under bombardment and the recurring threat of terrorist incursions into the capital over 14 years of war. Furthermore, the person who has never abandoned the resistance in Palestine and Lebanon, nor betrayed his allies who stood by him, cannot possibly be the same person who would forsake his own people or betray the army and nation to which he belongs. I have never sought positions for personal gain, but I have always considered myself a custodian of a national project, supported by the faith of the Syrian people who believed in its vision. I have carried an unwavering conviction in their will and ability to protect the nation state, defend its institutions, and uphold their choices to the very last moment. When the state falls into the hands of terrorism and the ability to make a meaningful contribution is lost, any position becomes void of purpose, rendering its occupation meaningless. This does not in any way diminish my profound sense of belonging to Syria and her people, a bond that remains unshaken by any position or circumstance. It is a belonging filled with hope that Syria will once again be free and independent. Now, that is an exceptionally dignified statement from Assad. He talks about himself to some extent in the third person, but he is giving here a description of the final events. He's saying that he was intending to keep on the battle, but that everything basically collapsed around him. He himself never gave up until after Damascus fell, when the Russians took the decision that the only remaining course was for him to resign and to leave for Moscow. And I believe him. I think this is absolutely correct. He also says that never at any point did he bargain or trade for personal advantage or for his life. He never betrayed his allies. He doesn't actually name them. Well, he does refer to the Russians as allies, but interestingly, he never talks about the Iranians. But he says that he always acted in Syria's interests as he understood it. It's a very dignified statement. I have to also say, it is again a very passive one. It describes events that took place as if he was a mere spectator to them. There is still no full explanation of why he didn't speak to the Syrian people throughout the entire period of the crisis as it unfolded, why he didn't visit his troops, why he didn't try to rally resistance, why he declined the last request from Erdogan for a meeting, why he remained in Damascus as everything around him fell apart. And, well, for that, no doubt, we will have to wait for the further explanation which he has promised. But this is what Assad has given us for the moment. I think that sense of passivity, that sense of resignation, that sense that Assad conveys that he did all he could, he did his best, he can't be expected to do more, gives a further insight as to why in the end he fell. We're talking about someone who didn't ultimately have that guileful, ruthless, pugilistic quality that you need in the Middle East in order to survive. Well, I will be returning to that in my next program, where I will also deal with the quite bizarre meeting between Ursula von der Leyen and President Erdogan in Turkey, which has just taken place. I'll be returning to all of that in my next program. And of course, there'll be many more developments in Ukraine, in the war there. But that will be in my program tomorrow. In the meantime, let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star. and by checking out our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day.